today. Thanks to all of you for coming. So this is Dr. Rob Smith. He's a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, and he did his PhD and undergrad at Nottingham, where we first met. We've been long-term collaborators. Rob's doing some really exciting work around fine governance, and I think today he's going to take us on some tour around Tuscany, which will be lovely, and talk about some castles. So over to you.
Well, yeah, I would say to like pull us out of the depths of the winter, you can see yeah, thanks. I feel like it's been ages, a long time coming. So some life changes, which seem to have followed me into the room. But yeah, no, it's great to see some of you and to meet the rest of you. So yeah, this kind of weirdly titled talk is a collaborative paper that I've been doing with Jane Calvert in Edinburgh as part of our project on future organisms, which is studying the development and emergence and development of the field of synthetic biology and synthetic genomics. So I'll talk more about obviously in a second, but we're really interested in these kinds of visions of governance that keep reappearing within this field. And we're also quite triggered by them. And so this is also a talk partly about us being frustrated by these and thinking about whether there's anything we can actually do about that, or whether it's just something we need to live with. So, my like smooth segue through it. So I'm going to take you on some speculative ethnography, which I promise isn't because we haven't done any field work. We've done lots of field work, so there's something to be gained by engaging in kind of speculative. So this is a talk about that. It's also a talk, I think, about contingency and serendipity as potential kind of remedies for ideas like control and power and authority that often dominate in the kind of technosciences. And it might also be a talk about method, I'm not sure yet, and about this idea of studying with that we've been developing. So I just want to say a little bit about that, because in future organisms and in our work more generally, I think we've just kind of realized that there's potentially a kind of usual way of thinking about doing STS, which is a kind of like observationary kind of mode, which kind of draws a boundary between the thing that we're studying and our own practices. In synthetic biology, so the field that I'm working in, there's often a very kind of core mode in which kind of social sciences are subordinated to the natural sciences. So it provides services often under labels like responsible research solution. But I think in future organisms, we're really interested in thinking about whether it's a third mode of research that we can then practice that brings these maybe the kind of objects of our research, or what we normally do to people that we're studying, into a kind of more collaborative, participatory kind of format. And I think I'll come back to this right at the end of the talk. So, I think this talk has become an exercise in thinking about whether we can begin to do more collaborative work. So I mentioned that this, I should also say, 2 days ago I got a terrible cold, not man flu, like actually genuinely, so I'm sucking strepsils, but hopefully it won't be too distracting. So yeah, so I mentioned this is a project that's studying a field called synthetic genomics. And this is a subfield of synthetic biology. It's basically synthetic biology, but at the whole genome scale. And the aim for most of the people here is to redesign organisms. So to create organisms from scratch, or to redesign existing organisms to make them more manipulable and controllable. There's a kind of long history of projects in this area. So actually, if you talk to some scientists, they would go back into kind of the mid-20th century, but the kind of canonical stories that you'll hear around the synthesis of poliovirus, synthesis of Mycoplasma genitalium, Mycoplasma mycoides, and then E. coli much more recently. These two here were done by Banter Institute, so kind of infamous in the Human Genome Project, and then synthetic biology kind of subsequently. And then more recently, there's a project which hasn't yet achieved its goal, I don't think. It's continuously on the precipice of like doing full synthesis, but to synthesize the first eukaryotic organism. So this will be a yeast, baker's yeast. That's called SC 2.0. And since 2016 or 2017, there have been these kind of continuous discussions about like, well, what do we do next? And what do we synthesize next? And the answer from scientists seems to be the human. So in 2016, there was a project called GP Wright that launched to claim that they were going to synthesize a human genome from scratch. That kind of crashed and burned in some ways and never really got off the ground. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the backstory of that. Very recently, last year, ARIA, so Dominic Cummings' new funding agency that he kind of dragged up and imagined on ARPA-H and ARPA-E in the US, decided that they were going to fund £60 million of research into synthesizing potato in the UK. But there's also other kinds of weird and wonderful projects around trying to synthesize the Iberian mole genome, mouse, the lab mice, moss, and in China, moss is in China, but in China they also want to synthesize 50,000 viruses as well. So there's a whole kind of range of these kind of genome synthesis projects that have emerged in the past 10 years. So, Synthetic Yeast Project made a commitment not to patent its work, the immediate work, but to kind of treat it as pre-competitive and be kind of commons-based. And so that was kind of an interesting development. It's really distracting the noise now. But most of the synthetic genomics work is pretty straightforwardly biotech modification of life in terms of the way we think about it. So even though the synthetic yeast project said that they weren't going to patent anything, the people that were involved in it have subsequently taken out patents on derivatives of the things that came out of it, on the methods that they used to kind of produce it, and there are several companies that have emerged as a result of that work. One of the companies that I think we're fascinated by is this company, Replay. And on their website, which is also lovely, like you should all go and look at the website because they raised $55 million in capital. They clearly spent a chunk of it on the website. But they talk about themselves as reprogramming biology by writing and delivering DNA. And the metaphor of writing is really important for them. They talk about themselves as authors, not editors. And so they're explicitly distancing themselves from genome editing. This is a thing that happens a lot in this field. Because one of the questions that comes up is why bother writing? Like, why bother doing this? But committing to writing is one of the things that they kind of really, I suppose, are into. The chairman of Replay is a person called Adrian Watson. It's also run by his collaborator Lachlan, who's a serial entrepreneur in biotech. And Adrian is great. He's a really interesting guy. He posts pictures of like fossils embedded in Roman architecture and like butterfly wings on frescoes in the Gallery Borghese. He's also got patents, obviously, because he's a biotech entrepreneur on nucleic acid synthesis, which is a key technology for synthetic genomics. He publishes on synthetic life in Daedalus with Lorraine Gaston and Chris Rose. And he writes in his spare time kind of book reviews of like contemporary popular biology kind of things like that. And one of his other passions is the Burgess Shale. Because it turns out that actually Replay is named after a thought experiment from Stephen Jay Gould's book, A Wonderful Life. And this was inspired by the diversity of organisms that were found in the Burgess Shale. And in doing this, the kind of aim is to emphasize the importance of contingency of life, right? So the idea is that if you replayed the work that happened, the Cambrian explosion, you would end up with a very different set of kind of life. It's very different from what we know today. who humanity wouldn't be kind of necessarily present for. So replay was inspired by this idea. It's very explicitly named after Gould's book. Yeah, and here's a quote from Gould. And Gould took his idea of replaying from It's a Wonderful Life in 1946, where the main character is an angel, shown by an angel how things would be very different without him. Right? So this is kind of central myth. So this is really exciting for us in lots of ways, because in a field which is kind of dominated by commodification and really like established kind of ideas in biotechnology, we found a guy who seems quite interesting, and that is committed to like this idea of replaying the type of life, which is about letting go of control, which is another metaphor which like dominates in biotechnology. And that particularly is kind of committed to perhaps this idea that like human existence might have an unlikely outcome if you did so. So really kind of interested in this idea of contingency and unpredictability. And it's exciting as well because we know that like while the mainstream kind of synthetic biology discussions are things that we're familiar with about being kind of about commodification, control, kind of putting life to work for humans. We know that some of the other scientists, often younger scientists that are working in this field, have different narratives about the way that the reasons that they're doing this work. So one scientist in the UK talks about learning to co-culture Clostridia with yeast to address unsexy problems that big labs can't solve as a way of leaving a world that's not burning for his child that's just been born. So it's about making the kind of living space together with these other organisms. Or a PhD student talks about how introns, so the non-coding regions of the genome, could be a kind of fossil record of ancient battles between ourselves and the world around us. And so it's kind of alternative narrative that it doesn't often make its way into kind of science. We find really exciting about this. The other thing that we're really excited about with replay, when we found it, was that they wanted to have an Asilomar for genome writing because they're concerned about the kind of ethical and social issues. So we thought, great, like it's something that we can kind of get our teeth into. Challenges is that when we went to a conference at the Sanger Institute in 2023, Adrian Wilson was there. And actually, the kind of way that he talks about this work is not really at all anything to do with letting go of control and embracing contingency. Actually, what he's interested in is, things like this. So, saying things like being able to write genomes with large control biology to the greater good. And then saying things that seem to be very familiar that we might have heard before, like we're at the crux of this incredible moment in human history where basically we're complex nature. I think that's the thing that's being said repeatedly throughout the 20th century. So actually, replay's idea of replaying the tape of life is really just about control rather than kind of contingency of historical developments. It's about rewriting life to fit human nature's needs and desires that are free from the constraints of evolutionary history, free from time. So it has this kind of, in a way, like a spectral time quality. There's a kind of discontinuity, like a temporal discontinuity. So instead of being about letting go of control and kind of emphasizing the contingency of human existence, it's something very different. But I think that in the rest of this talk, I want to stick with this idea of, is it possible to really create circumstances for things to turn out differently in governance of synthetic biology? And the reason I want to do that is because our favorite definition of governance and responsible innovation is a space of radical indeterminacy, the possibilities of other ways of being. So this was coined by our friend and collaborator Dee Scott. And I think the emphasis on space is really important here, right? Because spaces open up and allow things. Spaces can be reconfigured in different ways. So we want to kind of stay with this idea of space when kind of moving through these different vignettes. Okay, so that's some background. I'm going to go back to 1975 to the original Asilomar that Adrian Wilson wants to create now, or recreate. And so for those of you that don't know, the Asilomar conference was a really canonical, mythologized, important conference that was held in 1975 on the Monterey Peninsula in the Bay Area by a group of scientists who had agreed to a self-imposed moratorium on recombinant DNA experimentation. And this meeting was designed and seen as important as a way of coming up with safety guidelines which would allow you to move past the moratorium and recommence the work that was being paused. The guidelines that they came up with were translated by the NIH afterwards into safety guidelines which still exist today. So it was a kind of really significant moment in kind of the governance of biotechnology. It's also obviously mythologized as a moment of self-governance by scientists and a moment of kind of collective responsibility, and simultaneously criticized by STS for being a moment of power and kind of anti-democratic kind of work that can happen. So just to remind you what 1975 was like, I wasn't born. So this is Jane in 1975. And she's the person that's going to go back to this original conference, I think. This is not her dad. He's just a random guy at the zoo with her standing behind. And this just proves the point that it was in 1975 because he has excellent lapels. So to go back in time, obviously we can't just kind of walk back. We need some kind of way of doing that. Luckily we have a time machine. And maybe if we go back, we can think about what we would do differently or how we would kind of interact in this kind of conference. The challenge is that, like, as STS researchers, we would have been very out of place because even the kind of predecessors to STS, which didn't really exist at that point, was kind of very nascent, were excluded from the meeting. So there were some lawyers, but there weren't any bioethicists or anything like that. There weren't any sociologists or anthropologists. And that's because the meeting was a space controlled by the scientists that had a very kind of closed and carefully curated invitation list. But luckily we have a TARDIS, and the TARDIS gets us into the right places it would be possible to go, so it'd be fun. So we'd have to pretend, so we'd have to be in cover somehow. So I think we probably decided that we would either take some kind of role of like a journalist, which we're invited, or scientist, maybe I could pretend to be a scientist, or maybe a funder, and we'd maybe be able to participate in some of the conversations that were going on there, and maybe shape some of the things that they were saying. But actually, probably what would have happened is that we would have got fed up based on past experiences. And when that happens, what we usually end up doing is going for a walk somewhere on the edge of the event, probably to the beach. But then we would have been able to take some people with us, so these guys are also doing that as well. And I think this raises a question of, like, so if we're on these peripheral spaces, maybe we're often freer to kind of say things that we can't say in the kind of main halls and the main events. But what would we have said? And I think it's tricky to work back to answer that question, because actually there are historians that have been working in this area for a long time, so like Luis Campos, and he's done some really great work showing how this idea of Asilomar is actually a kind of a multiple. So there are lots of different memories of Asilomar that we could be going back to. And it's unclear which one we should be choosing and which one we're recreating and mythologizing. But also like STS, so we can choose, and we're going to choose the one that says that this was a narrow framing of conversations about the ethical and social issues associated with biotechnology, and that it's not about biosafety risk in the way that the scientists decided it should be. There are actually lots of other things that should be on the table. So things about visions, invested interests, and the problem that the meeting was framed in a particular way, so there was no space to talk about any of these kind of commitments that scientists were kind of building. But we might have said that. We've said that in lots of other meetings at the moment, recently, and nothing really seems to happen. So actually, probably there's nothing we could have really done. I think we both struggle to think of something that we could have done to change the kind of dynamic of this kind of meeting. And so in this kind of sense, again, this kind of notice that Asilomar has shifted from being a kind of concrete place, an event, the thing, in the spirit to a ghost that haunts the kind of current discussions of the intersection of science and society. Okay, so having gone backwards, I'm going to go forwards. I'm going to go to the future, to Tuscany, to Adrian's event. So Replay have this Asilomar gene writing that they wanted to convene. And we found out about this in a restaurant while we were talking to one of our scientific advisors who was invited to this meeting. And since finding out, I've been simultaneously repulsed and infatuated with this event. I kind of can't really tell you how infatuated I've been. I've dreams about it. And one of the reasons that I'm repulsed by it is that it's obviously a set of scientists who are self-invested in creating a set of criteria to work through so that they can get on with their scientific work. It's about moving past what they see as roadblocks and doing their own work. It's also obviously another closed and protected space, and for kind of elites to come together and decide what the appropriate issues are. We heard that the organisers of this event wanted to be more diverse than the original Asilomar. They wanted to kind of include different people, but it's still ultimately a protected space for people to kind of come together and enunciate. And as one of our participants did admit, what could be more elite than a castle in Tuscany? But I'm ultimately kind of into the idea still because I quite like to go on holiday to Tuscany. We've been once. I'd like to go back. The wine is very nice and the food is very good. And I'd also like the opportunity to hang out with people like Stephen Fry. So what they have to say to each other. It's the kind of people that they want to sort of thesis. They clearly have loads. I mean, we shouldn't like maybe these are the right people that should be talking about synthetic genomics. We later found out that Jane was also right. This is different. But the main issue, right, obviously, is that this is a closed meeting for thought leaders, and that I haven't been invited. Even if Jane has been invited, I wouldn't be able to go to this meeting. I need to work out how to do this. I guess I can try and sneak in with Jane, maybe. Or maybe I could just like follow her, or maybe I could pretend to be her or something. If you could decide she didn't want to go and have me invited me, that would probably be an option. But obviously, that's like a very uncomfortable position for this thing that we've just been very critical of in the past. It's really uncomfortable and it's really boring because these kinds of secret meetings are kind of part of the definition of synthetic genomics. So I mentioned in 2016 that scientists decided they wanted to create a human genome from scratch. This was a secret meeting. They held a closed meeting to talk about the possibilities of doing this. When the press found out, they obviously talked about it a lot. Several synthetic biologists wrote letters about why this was a problematic thing to do. And then the response was to open up their meetings and invite people to sit on ELSA panels where we would talk about all of the social and ethical issues without really doing anything about it. So I think these closed meetings are kind of a repeated motif in this field and things that we should be resisting as social scientists. So actually probably what I would do, and the thing that I'm most drawn to, is kind of hang out on the margins, on the periphery, stay on holiday in Tuscany, go and do my own thing. And I guess one of the obvious things that you could do as an STS researcher is to go out into the town square and we could ask people what they think about synthetic genomics. We could do some public participation, we could be like public engagement practitioners. We could maybe follow like methodologies that have been developed by Rob Meck and Andy Barmer to do kind of pop-up object-based elicitations around synthetic biology. This is actually not a terrible idea because there are lots of weird reasons why Tuscany might have Tuscan people might have complicated feelings about gene editing. So it's a very rich region, but it's also one which is very committed to like slow food. So actually, this you can make up some sociological arguments for this case worth doing. Not making them up. And maybe this would be a way of kind of taking seriously what people like Sheila and Van Hilbert talk about as coming down from the summit and kind of opening up and doing something. But I don't really do public engagement, and that seems like quite a lot of work, and I don't really know where I can money to do that. So actually, I think what I'm more interested in are the things that came to me in a dream when I was dreaming about a conference at another conference at the Sanger Institute. And these are really more about kind of radical interventions that you might make with kind of artistic methods. So I'm really interested in ideas like pieces of work that people like Taryn Simon have done. So Taryn Simon is a photographer, an artist, but she works as a visual artist, works with photography. She spent 5 years trying to get into some of the most secret sites in America to photograph them. It's in a book. This is one of the nuclear storage sites in the US. I think it's the most radioactive place on Earth. And then she photographed them. The one that she couldn't get into was Disneyland. And other people have done similar kinds of things. So an artist and my friend James Bettany tried to get into CERN as part of the public engagement science communication program, was rejected. And so instead walked the 200-mile circumference of the Hadron Collider, photographing the mundane that was going on above ground. And I think that these, in a way, are better critiques of the kind of secrecy of science than anything that we could ever do. Because I think they just really, just through juxtaposition, really draw that kind of out and put it on the surface and on display in a way that I think a lot of our kind of social scientific mediums don't do. We write about it, obviously, but it's a very different kind of form of engagement. I also think that like one of the reasons I'm kind of interested in this is because photography kind of as a methodology kind of really buys into ideas of commitment and serendipity and chance. So the critic Teju Cole says that he talks about the background to this image and decided it was great. But he says that, I looked at the image, that's the angels, there's a whole backstory to this photo. And he says that a great photo comes about through a combination of readiness, chance, and mystery. So there's a real engagement with contingency and serendipity here, which I think we could maybe learn something about. Challenges is that these are all very risky strategies, maybe not so much now, but they would have been a year ago. Because they involve me taking a stance against a particular event with the people that are part of our informants, our people that are, some of them will be our peers, maybe not Peter Thiel, but Sheila Jasanoff in our field, powerful actors. And there can people that kind of going back to the very start of this presentation, are people that we kind of committed to trying to think with rather than against or of. So in reality, actually what will probably happen with this event is that we kind of ignore it, or we're invited in and we'll just go and say some grumpy things about how the framings are too narrow, and it's an elite closed space and that we should be different. Except that luckily, we found out that the Tuscany Castle has been cancelled or postponed because there were too many people that they wanted to invite. And so we imagine that they said that we're going to be this. So the final piece of work that I want to just, ethnography that I want to talk you through is a real one. So something we actually did. So I mentioned that there are some visions of human genome synthesis that have been kind of circulating. The US one closed down, was never funded, didn't kind of take off. But in the background, a group of 4 scientists in the UK approached the Wellcome Trust and asked for startup funds about £2.5 million, to begin synthesizing the human genome. Wellcome said yes, because they were beginning to get interested in ideas around genome synthesis. Because it builds on their kind of histories of sequencing. So there's a narrative of moving from sequencing to synthesis. They're good at sequencing, so they should be good at doing synthesis as well. And they've just decided to make a large investment in this area. So they held a meeting to talk about social and ethical issues. One of the reasons that they're interested in is about the kind of history that they've developed around sequencing. But another one is also that there's a narrative of China doing this, and China don't do it. Well, we don't do it. China will, if you like, and then what could be worse than China doing this? So again, this is another roadblock. The meeting was organized mandatorily by the scientists and the social scientific teams that were accompanying them. And it was required by Wellcome for them to progress to kind of large-scale funding. So they had to organize this meeting to show that they were thinking about the ethical issues before they would give them money. So, you know, like Asilomar, like the Tuscan castle, it was an obligatory passage point. It had about 40 people in it. There were scientists, funders, ethicists, us. And again, this was more diverse than Asilomar. There was a very deliberate attempt to try and diversify the people in the room in this meeting. Wellcome has like quite good, I think, or they take them quite seriously, DEI policies, and so they had representation from a range of different places. But within this meeting, the logic of control is still there. So it produces these kind of beautiful vignettes. So they started the meeting, the kind of lead of the project stood up and said that genome synthesis may provide complete control over the genome. He's very demure and he's from Cambridge. And so when he says may, what he means is will. And then he says, in principle, we can get control of the properties of organisms, so something we might be able to do if you find us. Jane asked, you know, a question, maybe that control over biology isn't as easy as we thought it might be. Lots of our empirical work shows that actually that biology tends to kind of overflow and kind of not really kind of resist our attempts to kind of control. So ideas of engineering that you might pull from the kind of physical and material sciences don't really work in biology. PI was like, what are you proposing as an alternative? Jane said there are all these different ways of doing things, which admittedly is a little bit vague, and then he just looked on with like extraction and kept going. The other thing that happened in this meeting was that the conversation that we were pushed to was about future applications. So we were really pushed to kind of talk about speculative kind of things that might happen if this is funded. So these are topics that were kind of not really present in the Asilomar, so it's fair enough. But the problem is that if you do this, you're asking people to speculate about things that may come and avoid talking about the science that you're doing today. So it's a kind of a way of segregating the science from the conversation from the science, by producing a protected space for science. And really significantly and really importantly is that questions about the scope of the research and why this was being funded were not on the agenda, were not able to be on the agenda, were things that people really wanted to talk about and have constantly been talking about with synthetic genomics. Like, why bother doing this? And those decisions had been made. They were being made separately by Wellcome, by a kind of closed panel of people. So we got all of these kinds of questions about why do large-scale synthesis, why focus on the human instead of something else, like a mouse or a different mammal. If you focus on the human, which part of the human do you focus on? All of these kinds of really important questions were framed out of the conversation in a very familiar way to anything that to any of these kind of group events. So again, in this kind of circumstance, it doesn't really matter how much you can diversify the experience, the expertise in the room, the kind of logics repeat again and again in the same table we played. So this has been like me mostly kind of dissing other people's meetings and conferences, but I want to just say that this is also something that repeats in our own meetings that we organise as well. So our own conferences where we try to create space to talk about the kind of governance of synthetic biology and how things could be different. Even in those kinds of meetings, we have, when we have complete control over the participants and the program, they end up taken over by powerful technological visions. So scientists will come in and talk about, well, the science, I guess, and they often speak loudest and kind of end up controlling the agenda. And so we're still stuck with this question of how can we begin to do things differently? What are the opportunities that we might do? So we can see a range of different kind of spectres of Asilomar that often kind of appear in these kind of meetings and conferences, privacy genomics. They're protected and they're elite. They're often self-invested, necessary kind of meetings that have to happen so you can kind of enable progress, which means the funding of the science. They're separated, so they're often separated either from the ethical conversations or significant salient, or the room might decide as the salient ethical issues. They're almost always separated from the public sphere, they're not public meetings. The matter of concern, which is sort of defined to be the most important topic, is safety or ethics, speculative ethics usually, and they operate within a kind of logic of control, which is dominant within technology. Brings us very explicitly to haunting, and I think there's a lot of kind of really nice literature on this, so this is kind of like a cool topic at the moment. But this quote by Sadiq Rahimi, I think, captures the kind of idea of haunting. So haunting isn't just about kind of being spooky and having ghosts and things following you around. It's about the kind of deliberate foreclosing of a possible future, like an alternative possible future. Through acts of power that shape the spaces that we act in and that we create. And so we're still stuck thinking about whether or not we have to keep replaying memories of Asilomar, cosplaying maybe, instead of replaying, and how we can kind of get out of this cycle. One of the things that we're thinking about is whether or not so the idea of haunting was coined by hauntology, was coined by Derrida, and it's famously impenetrable and vague, and so there are lots of different ways of reading this kind of literature. So there's a kind of one strand of anthropology that talks about it, and particularly English post-industrial social theory that talks about this foreclosing of futures. But there are other readings of this that talk about haunting and paying attention to the kind of temporal breaks as in a kind of positive light. So as a way of opening up alternatives. Inheritance is always a given, it's never given, it's always a task, it's always a kind of active piece of work that we always have to be doing. And then people like Gordon and Shaw, and also Astrid Trader, place here, also talks about it in this kind of more positive way. So, we have to learn to live with our ghosts, in fact, keep the conversation, the company, the companionship, and to be with them. To the kind of clear connection to this idea of collaboration and studying with what we feel interested in. So maybe what we should be doing when we're trying to create these spaces is to commit more wholly to contingency and serendipity. Maybe we have to let go of our own aspirations for control when we create kind of spaces to talk about the ethical and social and allow for mutual transformation and emergence to happen. Instead of building safe spaces for elites to talk about predetermined topics, maybe we should be trying to create unsafe or unpredictable spaces. Maybe we should be setting off fire alarms to kind of shake things up. Maybe we should be embracing abundance and mess and getting out of the kind of this room. Maybe we should go for a walk or something. And I think in part that's why we've been, that's also why I'm interested in photography and because of serendipity. But I think that's also why we've written elsewhere about how we're interested in the peripheral spaces of these events. Because often on the peripheries, we find that there's a kind of more space to talk candidly and openly in unexpected ways. So maybe we should be thinking about trying to create peripheral spaces for these kinds of events, create events where the periphery is kind of the main reason for being there. And because on the periphery, kind of emergent things can happen. So pubs and diners and things like that. But can you have an event that's wholly peripheral? Because a relational concept, and so you still need a reason to meet, and that meeting might still be a thing which is problematic or that you're kind of in opposition to. So what is it? How would that work in practice? Or maybe we should be thinking about kind of alternative rationales and logics of engineering life. So instead of engineering for humans, we should be engineering for other than humans or more than humans, which is a really kind of contemporary current piece of work which is being done by Daisy Ginsburg, called Holocaust Pathmaker, which is partly based here. And because Daisy asks what would happen if gardens are designed for non-humans. It's a different kind of logic of engineering that you arrive at. Maybe that's the kind of approach that we should be taking. But the other option, and the one that I'm kind of drawn to be honest, is just like not engaging at all. And not going to the governance of synthetic genomics meetings that are being convened. Not talk about like Asilomar or Asilomar events or Asilomar moments, because basically we know that everything will be decided and the impact that we have on those spaces is kind of will be limited and marginal. So maybe our Tuscan castle should remain a dream, the castle in the sky. Except, so in a kind of weird turn of events, a historian of science, Luis, and some of his other historian of science friends at the Science History Institute, and Drew Endy, famous synthetic biologist, have decided that the thing that we should do instead is to convene a 50th anniversary conference at the Asilomar grounds in February. And so we have been invited to this. It's another space that we kind of have to engage with. And admittedly, I'm quite ambivalent about this. For a long time, I thought I shouldn't go. And then I realized that I was a free trip to California and that was worth doing. But we're still not really sure about how we should engage with this meeting. It's happening in 2 months' time. And so I'd love some ideas from you. One of the things that is different about it, also familiar, is that it's diverse. Again, very, very deliberate effort to diversify the people, both from their geographies and also their career stages. It has a next generation leaders program for 50 early career academics to go. Still very elite. It's very competitive to get into. Lots of people are not going. So it has artists, because it's different and distinctive, so they're going to be doing some stuff. And it has these 4 themes: synthetic cells, beyond biocontainment, AI and synthetic biology and futures. And a lot of these, again, are going to be very familiar for you, I think. And so the reason that we're ambivalent about this is because I think there's a very strong risk that it just continues the kind of policy syndromes that have been repeating again and over and over again. I think it's like a high trigger factor in this meeting. And that's also something that maybe we would be wise to avoid. The other thing that's happened is if you take a kind of meta approach, is that the same kind of debates are playing out over and over again around this meeting. So 2 days ago, 3 commentaries were published in Science by 3 elite American academics from 3 slightly different perspectives, talking about the need to diversify the people that were in the meeting, to instead not take Asilomar as the model for adjudicating or assessing or discussing the social dimensions of synthetic biology, and instead to take that author's own elite space, it will be a very different kind of space, as the right approach to do that. So to take the global observatory engineering as the right model instead, and then the historian kind of complicating everything in those narratives. But the challenge we have is that we've also been asked, I don't know if this is trolling by Maurice, to organize an event on a beach, on the periphery of it at night when everyone has gone to sleep, presumably, to bury Asilomar, which is also something that James Watson wrote about trying to do and wanting to do 3 years after the event. And so I don't really know what we're going to do with this, and I would love your ideas. Thank you.